Recently, I was looking on the BBC website and they had an article and it was about the most deprived areas in the UK. In top spot, Middlesbrough. And in third spot, a town that is close to my heart, a town that is close to where my family are from, and also close to Middlesbrough is a town called Hartlepool. So that means in the top three, you have two places that are very close to each other that are considered the most deprived areas in the UK. Over 50% of people in Middlesbrough come under the category of deprived, according to this BBC piece of research, and over 42% in Hartlepool. I wanted to know why. So my question this week in this episode of Joe Chambers Questions Everything is, why are these areas so deprived? My family are from a former mining colliery not far from Hartlepool, and these areas in particular were most hit and affected when the coal mining industry came to a close as a result to policies put in place by Margaret Thatcher's government. So I wanted to explore the impacts and the long-term effects of the policies implemented by Margaret Thatcher around the 1980s to see what are the long-term effects and how it's affected these areas, especially the areas that affect my own family. So in this episode, I'm speaking to Professor Steve Farrall, who has done research into the impacts of Thatcherite policies on crime. And I think you'll be very interested to hear about the long-term impacts of crime, how these areas that have been doubly impacted by the demise of their industries have also seen the increase of prisons being erected in those communities. So the question I'm asking is, what are the long-term impacts of Margaret Thatcher's policies? What is her legacy? And in this podcast, you will have what will seem like a private lecture all about the impacts of Thatcher's policies on crime, and it will help paint the picture as to why these areas such as Middlesbrough, Hartlepool, and other former industrial areas have become so deprived. And it might help you to understand the context in which we see today, where we have a great division between the north and the south, and where there's some communities that are flying flags for England, for the United Kingdom, and really they are desperate pleas for help and for a change in the economy to bring back jobs and industry. So I hope you enjoy this podcast. I hope you learn something. And if you have any questions that arise in your mind as a result of what is discussed in this podcast, then please comment and don't forget to like and subscribe. So I hope you enjoy the podcast. Hi, and welcome back to another episode of Joe Chambers Questions Everything. Today, I'm joined by Steve Farrall, who is a professor of criminology at the University of Nottingham. Thank you for joining me. How are you doing today?
I'm very well, thank you, Joe. How are you?
Yeah, I'm not too bad. I've spent the last few days preparing for this conversation by delving into Margaret Thatcher's legacy. Just for reference, I come from a coal mining background. My granddad was involved in the unions, so I do have a certain depiction of Margaret Thatcher, but I still like to be open-minded and, look at her and her legacy from an objective point of view. But I've seen that you've done work around this, and I'm really interested to explore the analysis you've done around her legacy on the UK. So, shall we begin? I mean, you have written about Thatcher's legacy, I think, in relation to crime in particular. And before we started this recorded conversation, you showed me something that was very interesting, and I think just ties into her wider legacy. So, if you could you tell us a little bit about your past work, and then also what you're working on at the moment?
Yeah, sure. I became interested in Thatcherism probably getting on for the best part of 20 years ago now. I was giving a talk in Australia, not related to Thatcherism at all. It was about crime in the marketplace, sort of, misusing store cards and overclaiming insurance, those sorts of things. And we were looking at 3 countries: the former West Germany, the former East Germany, and England and Wales. And I said to the people there, all academics, all working in Australia, that there were really 2 big events that shaped that project that happened in the 1980s. One of them was the collapse of communism and the collapse of the Berlin Wall, which obviously affected Germany and affected the economy in Germany. And the other event is Margaret Thatcher. And at that point, everybody laughed. And I wasn't really expecting that. And then, a little while later, I gave another talk on that in a British university, and it got picked up by Radio 4, and I appeared on the Today programme. And I was interviewed by John Humphreys, who asked me a bit about the project, and I explained something about what we were doing, and said that we were linking crime in the marketplace, that kind of, overclaiming travel expenses, padding insurance claims, those sorts of things, to underlying economic structures, and that these had changed a lot during the 1980s, both in Germany and in England and Wales. And he kind of rather dismissively said, "Oh, so it's all Margaret Thatcher's fault," and went on to, invite on the guy to talk about sport or the weather or something like that. And those 2 things happening within a kind of 6 months or 12 months of each other made me start to think about Thatcherism. I was working in a university that had a very strong political science department. I was working in a department of criminology, and we saw them in the corridors and we talked to them, and they were doing lots of work on all sorts of things. And of course, Thatcherism had been a big part of political science back in the 80s and 90s. But at that point, nobody was really talking about Thatcher and crime. So I started to delve into this, and I found very little on the relationship between Thatcherite ideologies and Thatcherite social and economic policies and crime rates. But if you look at crime rates in England and Wales, they are kind of bumping along throughout the 1950s and 1960s. It's only really when it gets to about 1966 that recorded crime in England and Wales goes above about 1 million recorded crimes a year. And then it climbs quite dramatically throughout the 1970s. But when it gets to the 1980s, it really, really takes off. And we get millions of crimes reported to the police each year throughout the middle 1980s on into the early 1990s. So it peaks somewhere around about 1992 at around about 5.5 million crimes reported to the police in England and Wales each year. And of course, around about that time, we had all sorts of not just industrial strife. There was, of course, the miners' strike in the kind of the middle phase of the 1980s. But we also saw lots of what is typically referred to processes of economic restructuring. So we saw, for example, not just mines close after the miners' strike, but all of the things that went with that. So steelworks started to close, the railway marshalling yards and the trains that took coal and steel and all those sorts of things around. Also saw losses in terms of jobs and all of the infrastructure that supported those sorts of things. Shipbuilding had gone earlier, but we also saw reductions in car manufacturing, for example. So there was this massive phase really from the middle 1980s onwards that was associated with economic restructuring and the loss of lots of what are now referred to as blue-collar jobs. And so it struck me as curious that nobody was linking that huge, big economic transformation in the UK economy to crime, which also, really took off at that period too. And so whilst there was lots of economic modelling that suggested that as unemployment increased, so would, for example, property crime, so things like burglary, shop theft, those sorts of things, rather than simply fights, which is classified as kind of violent crime, personal crime. So as more people became unemployed, so property crime would pretty much always go up. And it's not a perfect fit, because one's lagged. It takes a couple of years for people who've been working to run out of money, etc., and then start to think about committing crime. There's a strong relationship between unemployment and property crime in most societies. And what I started to do then was to think, well, to what extent were the economic and then the social policies that were adopted during the 1980s the result of, if you like, Thatcherite thinking? And of course, the evidence there is fairly strong. Margaret Thatcher came in with a strong sense of what to do about the economy. And she started to enact that, hence huge levels of unemployment and economic restructuring, particularly in that line. If you draw in your head a line between the Wash in East Anglia and the Severn Estuary around about Bristol, places to the west and north of that, so Wales, that thing that we call the Midlands and Northern England and Scotland, really were the places where lots of that economic restructuring was most keenly felt. And that what we then also did as a research team over a number of years was start to explore the way in which the social policies as well affected not so much just the rates of crime, because that's largely driven by economic factors, but where crime was. So we looked, for example, at the 1980 Housing Act, which is an act that's always remembered fondly by the people in the Conservative Party as being the act that enabled lots of ordinary local authority housing tenants to buy their own house. And that's essentially what happened. But not all local authority housing is equally desirable. Flats, for example, are not as desirable as houses were. Houses which are detached are always more popular than semi-detached or terraced houses. And so literally different housing styles were sold more quickly and to a greater extent than some other housing types, as it were. And so what you had is a kind of a quite uneven sale of council properties. You had some areas where you had lots of the housing sold because it was desirable, and also because lots of the people in that area had jobs. And then there were other places, other communities that where there weren't really many council houses sold because either the properties weren't really particularly desirable, they were flats, or they were low-rise buildings, or they were maisonettes, which were ruled out of sales anyway. And because a lot of the people there had been made redundant by some of the economic processes. Now, selling council houses is one thing, but it's always a good idea to kind of replenish that stock. But one of the things that the 1980 Housing Act and lots of the acts that followed it, there was almost an act every other year that related to housing throughout the 1980 in one form or another. They prevented councils from either using that money to reinvest in the stock and make it better, but also they prevented councils from building new stock. So slowly over time, we've had this kind of diminishing of the amount of local authority housing, council housing, that was available for people to request and then to rent. And so what one sees with that is an increase in unemployment over time, because councils have a statutory obligation to house people who are in need, people who are in crisis. The council estates which were left become almost exclusively made up of those people who are the most needy in society. So I grew up in a series of council estates from, Central Belt Scotland when I was a kid, right down to the southeast of England, where I kind of mainly grew up in my formative years. And lots of the people in those council estates were, like my parents, working, both of them, not claiming benefits, working for stable employers. They sent their kids to, the local schools, and they had all sorts of aspirations for their kids to go to university and or get jobs and things like that. Some of the people that worked, some of the people that were neighbours in one of the estates I lived in were teachers who had arrived in that town to start teaching, couldn't yet afford to buy, so rented for a couple of years, and when they'd saved up the money for a mortgage, would then apply for a mortgage and kind of moved on. So they were very stable, very well-ordered estates that were a combination of either those people who were, what you would properly think of as being the working class, those people who were the, if you like, aspiring working class, and those people who were in kind of lower lower kind of middle class occupations, and lower middle class simply because they were career young at that stage in their life. So they were sort of what would now be referred to as junior teachers, or nurses, or people who were kind of running a small sort of plumbing business. So that they were very, very, very well ordered, well run estates. But as councils ran out of stock, they had to put all of these people that had quite high levels of need into the housing that they had left, which, as I mentioned earlier, was kind of clustered together. And so you have, in the space of a relatively short period of time, by which I mean sort of 20 years, you go from housing estates like the one that I've characterised that I grew up in, to housing estates in which the vast majority of people aren't necessarily working, or they're not working regularly. They're dependent on welfare payments. Often the schools are not particularly good in that area, and it must be said that a lot of investment was done in trying to improve some schools under Labour. But you go from this kind of like well-ordered, well-structured, well-running, self-policing communities in the 70s and early 80s to places by the turn of the century, so the late 90s going into the 2000s, had become, in some respects, pretty much, and this is a dreadful word to use, pretty much sort of social dumping grounds. They were the places where people would really only live if they had no other choice. And so we looked at the extent to which those processes were associated with crime, and indeed they were. So if you're using data from what's called the General Household Survey, at the start of the 1970s, if you were in a house that you owned, or if you were in a house that you socially rented, your levels of burglary were kind of, always favoured the people who owned their own houses because they could invest in locks and things like that. But those burglary rates in domestic properties were pretty much stable from what we can tell throughout the 1970s. Yes, you were more likely to be burgled if you lived in rented accommodation, socially rented accommodation, but it stayed fairly flat throughout the 1970s. When you get to the 1980s and you see the start of the big sell-off of housing under the right to buy, the thing that the 1980 Housing Act introduced, you see very quickly an increase in, or change really, in the underlying populations that lived in these areas. So you had far more people who were unemployed, far more people who were claiming benefits, far more people who were elderly or from ethnic minority backgrounds. And this is not, of course, to blame anybody for that. It's just a recognition that these are some of the more needy groups, particularly in the 1980s. And with that, you see an increase in domestic property crime. So you see more burglaries, more thefts from sheds, more attempts to break into people's houses. And that really skyrockets for people in the socially rented sector. It does go up for people in the people who own their own houses, if you like, the middle class. That goes up as well, but property crime was going up for everybody. But the real increase was amongst those people who were in socially rented sector. So not only did the sort of social and economic policies that were pursued by the Thatcher governments increase crime, they actually socially re-engineered where crime was, so that you got far more of it in the socially rented areas than you did in areas where people kind of owned or had mortgages. And when crime started to come down, which it did in the mid kind of 90s, it came down faster in those areas where people were owner occupiers, um, relative to those people who were living in socially rented housing. So again, so that's one example of a big, you know, flagship policy, which is still a famous one today, the right to buy. And there are now councils who are pushing back on the right to buy. They're saying, we want to buy back that housing. We're not going to sell any more of it off, because in some respects, they've realised the extent to which it robs those local authorities of an income, but is also associated with all sorts of other problems that are very hard to tackle. So people that are living in entrenched areas of unemployment or low levels of work or low levels of skilled work, and whose children then kind of become acculturated to that as well, and kind of give up on schooling and the idea of working and being able to contribute to society through taxation and through doing, you know, the kind of jobs that everybody wants everybody else to do, you know.
I imagine that it's reinforced by the fact that there was a massive restructuring of the economy, less people in jobs, and those jobs are linked to industries and, for instance, coal mining, steel, that were in, say, the north. So you've got a sort of reinforcing mechanism of people going into houses requiring benefit, but then not having the ability to get a job to then get out of that situation. And for instance,
Yes,
the town near where my family are from, Hartlepool, they were in a state a few years ago where they had to police their own streets, and people would have to take turns to be vigilantes, because crime and theft from vans were so bad. If you were sort of a tradesman and you had tools in your van, people would come and try and break into the van to steal from you, and I think it's a great example of what you just spoken about.
I mean, one of the things when you're thinking about large scale change that's driven either by policies, which is the case in economics, or which is driven by social change, which is engineered through the law, which is the case in terms of housing acts, is that these are policies that apply nationally, largely. And these are bits of legislation that apply nationally as well. And when I say nationally, I'm talking
Hmm.
about England and Wales, although in the economic sense that would probably also have applied to Scotland as well. But the UK, and even if you forget about the bit of the UK called Northern Ireland for a minute, you just think about England, Scotland and Wales, the UK is a very uneven place in terms of the kind of industries that existed at any one particular point of time. So you did have, for example, large pockets of coal mining in South Wales, in the area between really Merseyside on the west and the Humber on the east, the northeast shoulder of England, around towns and cities like uh, Middlesbrough and Sunderland and Newcastle, and then in the Scottish Central Belt between Glasgow and Edinburgh. And so these were places that had large levels of mining and all of the industries that were associated with that. And the modelling that we did suggested that the area in which you lived and were born had a huge impact on what happened to you at school, which then had a huge impact on whether you truanted at school, which then had a huge impact on whether you were engaged, whether you became engaged in offending as a teenager. So what we looked at was, at a county level, the number of people that were working in mining and associated industries at one census point, and then 10 years later, the number of people aged between, or the number of men rather, aged between 16 and 59 who were unemployed. And that became our measure of economic restructuring. So if you like, that's going from heavy industry to large levels of unemployment in a 10-year period. And that was the period leading up to the birth, not when they were working, not even when they were born, but the period leading up to the births of the kids that we studied. That shaped then whether they did well at school in terms of truanting, felt engaged in school or felt alienated from school. And that level of alienation then impacts on their offending at the age 16 and then their offending as an adult as well. And we did that. We looked at two cohorts of people, one born in 1958. And what we often find for the 1958 cohort when we look at it is lots of the theorizing that we had about economic change and what that would do to individuals' lives wasn't really particularly well supported by the data. Either the data didn't fit the model, so if you like, the theory was completely wrong, or it did fit the model, but it was a very weak explanation of what was going on. And of course, that was the cohort born in 1958. When we did exactly the same thing, using exactly the same kind of survey questions, exactly the same kind of measures of economic restructuring and school alienation and things like that for a cohort who were born in 1970, we find that the model does fit. So what we were expecting to find for the 1970 cohort, we found. So greater levels of economic restructuring in the county that you were born in was associated with feeling alienated from school, was associated then with becoming involved in crime as a teenager, and was associated with offending into adulthood. But it wasn't there for the cohort that were born just 12 years earlier. There's only 12 years between 1958 and 1970. But yet, for those individuals who were born in 1970, they kind of grew up in a completely different world. So if you look at the people born in 1958, they were 21 when Margaret Thatcher came to power. Now, 21 doesn't sound like it's particularly old these days. I teach students that are around 21. But in the late 1970s, early 1980s, 21, you really were a full, proper adult. You were expected
You'd
to
be
work.
married, house,
You could have
kids.
kids and all the rest of it. Yeah, buy a house, etc., etc. But for those people born in 1970, they were still 9 when Thatcher came to power in 1979. So, although they're only 12 years apart, that's like half a generation, and that crucially affected the 1970 birth cohort much more because they were still growing up. They were going through school during periods of huge economic turbulence in some of those communities, and they were starting to become involved in crime because they could, look around them and think, well, there are no jobs here. Why are we thinking about? Why are we worrying about going to school when there are no jobs? Let's bunk off and just doss about. And in some respects, then that's what happened for lots of those kids, and that they were part of the reason why crime went through the roof. The other thing that they then led on to inadvertently was New Labour's focus when they came into power in 1997 on antisocial behaviour, because you can kick kids out of school, and there were lots of good reasons for kicking kids out of school if you were a head teacher. But they're not going to vanish just because they're not in school. They are going to hang around on street corners, and they became a kind of a trope of, the media and society 25, 30 years ago, these kind of yobs hanging around street corners that should have been at school, that were smoking and swearing and spitting and all the rest of it. And that's where Labour come in and start talking about being tough on crime and focusing on ratcheting up sentencing particularly for people that were committed what they referred to as antisocial behaviour. So not really kind of proper crimes, but sort of nuisances that we wanted to purge our streets of. And also Labour talked about being tough on the causes of crime, and that for them really meant reinvesting in some of the communities that had experienced some of the worst of these kind of economic changes. So one of the other things that happens under Thatcherism, and this isn't just Thatcherism, it's true of all of these kind of neoliberal marketized models is that choice becomes a really key word. People want choice about this. They want choice about the other thing. They want choice about which schools to send their kids to. Now, you then have to produce some scoring system to help people make choices. And the scoring system that was alighted upon, and is still used, is the number of GCSE passes used to be C, or now I think it's a 5, that a school has. It's percentage of kids that get 5 or more GCSEs at a C or 5. Now, as a head teacher, you don't want to become bottom of the league table anywhere. And so that provided the head teachers with a ready-made motivation, if you like, for kicking out those kids, because A, they weren't going to do well. They weren't going to get GCSEs that were going to contribute towards that school's overall performance. But also, by jostling around in class, they would then help distract other kids who might do well, who were on the cusp of getting 4 or 5 GCSEs, and you wanted them to get 5. So in some respects, you took out the, it's kind of rotten apple theory. You took out the rotten apple and expelled them from school, and then the other kids should do well. But as I said a minute ago, just by kicking those kids out of school, they don't necessarily vanish. They hang around and they get into trouble in public places. So we have this kind of start of neoliberal thinking, really, when Thatcher becomes leader of the Conservative Party in 1975. And they spend a long time thinking about how you can, diagnosing what they consider to be the problems with the UK from an economic perspective, but also to some extent from a social perspective as well. And then when they come into power in 1979, they then start to deliver on some of that economic philosophies. They also claw back. They make the welfare state much less generous. So the total spending for the welfare state in the 1980s goes through the roof. But the number of applicants to it also goes through the roof. So although the spend goes up, each individual claimant gets less money than they would have done previously. So there's a kind of a tightening down of what can be claimed and how much can be claimed. And that's referred to in the literature as welfare retrenchment. So we have the economic policies leading to economic change, which leads to social problems, which then are met with more legislation, which tries to reduce spending. You have spillovers from that in terms of the number of children that are, in that instance, for example, jostling around, bunking off school, or the number of people that are being put into local authority housing because there's really nowhere else to put them. And then what that does is it leads to the kind of the identification of those particular areas and those particular communities as being problems that need to be solved, people who need to kind of, do the right thing and get on and get a job, and to quote Norman Tebbit, get on their bike and look for work. But there isn't any work locally, so you can't do that. This then becomes entrenched, and then you have an increase really in what's referred to as the worry about crime. So people, the British Crime Survey, as it was once called, is now called the Crime Survey for England and Wales. One of the things that it has always measured, as well as victimisation, is how much people are worrying about a particular set of crimes. So the social and economic policies drive up problems, that drives up crime, that drives up worry about crime. That was a survey which was new in the 1980s, and so it attracted a lot of attention from politicians who then talked big on crime. I said they were going to do all sorts of things to toughen sentences and all the rest of it. Actually, Margaret Thatcher's government was not particularly tough on crime. In fact, actually, she's the only post-war prime minister who saw decreases in the prison population while she was in office. All of the others saw increases, particularly prime ministers since that period. But politicians talk up crime, they kind of grandstand on it, they become policy entrepreneurs on pushing particular policies through. But the criminal justice system in England and Wales doesn't really become properly punitive until after Margaret Thatcher has left office. And Margaret Thatcher leaves office in November 1990. John Major comes in, and he puts new people in the cabinet. And one of the people that he puts in the cabinet is a guy called Michael Howard, who comes in as Home Secretary. And whilst the criminal justice system had been kind of delivering on a kind of socially liberal, let's not send people to prison, let's try and help them, let's try and educate them, let's try and get them off drugs, all of that sort of stuff, up until really 1991, when Michael Howard comes in, there's a complete change in outlook. And from 1993 onwards, there was a Criminal Justice Act in 91, and there was a Criminal Justice Act in 1993. The 1993 Act is really the start of the beginning of the criminal justice system becoming more and more punitive. So there are two things that the criminal justice system does. It tries to help people, it tries to divert them from custody, it tries to rehabilitate them in various sorts of ways. All of the diversion from custody stops after 1991, and we go into this huge, big kind of drawing people into the criminal justice system. And that's the other thing that the criminal justice system, as well as helping some people, it punishes people as well. And the increases in punishment go in a number of different ways. First of all, there were longer sentences, so people would go to prison for, on average, longer than they would have done, had they committed the same offence 10 years previously. More of them would go to prison. So there would be the idea that prison works, prison is a deterrent, prison will stop people reoffending, comes to the fore. And lots of the stuff that people were doing, for example, around probation or, unpaid work in the community, gets kind of, if you like, suppressed discursively. And we really start to think about prison as being the only thing that can be done, as it were, to encourage people to stop offending or to not start in the first place. But the other thing that the criminal justice system does is it constructs evidence against people. So it used to be that, and it still is to some extent, that there are all sorts of checks and balances to make sure that the police can, not fabricate evidence, or if they fabricate evidence, it comes to court, it comes to attention and it's ruled inadmissible at court, all of those sorts of things. Now, lots of those things, not just under the criminal justice system from 1993 onwards, but under New Labour as well, start to be kind of rowed back. So it becomes the case that the defence has to provide its evidence to the prosecution, not just that the prosecution has to tell the defence what its case is. The defence has to tell the prosecution what its case is. And similarly, there are other sentences, legislation passed that tie the hands of judges. So judges then have to sentence people to custody if they have committed a certain number of offences of a certain particular type before. And then we see things introduced around about 15, 20 years ago that mean that it becomes easier to collect evidence, and evidence that previously may not have been admissible in court is now becomes admissible in court. And you have this blurring between the civil legal system that deals with housing and divorces and those sorts of things, and the criminal justice legislation. So, for example, creating noise in a nuisance in a public place may once have been a civil offence, but if you're issued a antisocial behaviour order and you fail to comply with it, then that becomes a criminal offence. So people are drawn from the low-level civil offences into much more serious criminal offences, where they can start to attract the attention of judges, and the sentences would be, or possibly, custodial, or in the criminal justice sense rather than in the civil law sense. So we see this kind of, all of this you can trace back to what was going on in terms of the ideas underlying Margaret Thatcher and her team's critique of the problem of the UK slowly, and it is very slow, it takes decades for this stuff to work through the system, slowly start to emerge in terms of their consequences, in some respects, into the mid to late 1980s. And then in terms of the criminal justice system and its response to rising crime, that really kicks in about 7, 8, 9 years later. So we have this very delayed, slow-moving process. It's a bit like, if you remember, a game called Mousetrap. So with Mousetrap, I can't remember exactly how it worked, but you would inadvertently kick a marble, and that would roll down, and it would knock something, and it would knock something that would do something, and then slowly, eventually, a trap would land on a mouse, and it would, if you were a kid, it was great fun to watch because it would take a whole minute and you could see all these different parts moving. But we have something similar in terms of social and economic policy. It takes a very long time to draft legislation. So the ideas that get turned into policy papers and white papers, and then legislation, and then that you need to give people who are delivering it time to think about how they're going to deliver it. And then you need the consequences, or you need to wait for the consequences to emerge. That might take literally years, possibly in some cases decades. So this is a very slow-moving beast that we're describing. And that, I suspect, is really at the heart of why, going back to why I first got into exploring the relationships between Thatcherism and crime, very, very few people, if anybody, had really tied the increases in crime in the 1980s to some of those social and economic policies, because the lagged effects, the delay between the cause and the outcome is so great. And charting the path between, we're not simply talking about causes, we're talking about the causes of causes. So this happened. Well, why did that happen? Well, that's because this happened. Why did this happen? Well, that's because of this. Why did that happen? Well, that's because of this idea. And the idea was that you could, in some respects, just let the market loose on society, and that things would get better. I mean, we've been doing that really since 1979, or if you want to push it back a few years earlier, you could talk about Labour needing to call in the IMF. And here we are in 2025. So we've been given this our best shot for 50 years or so.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure there are many people that would say it's working really well. So if neoliberal thinking works well, people in the UK should be really happy, should be really delighted with the way in which the services work. But my sense is that people are not particularly happy. The news I was listening to earlier was about, people over the age of 90 waiting up to 36 hours in hospital. Not waiting, waiting in hospitals to be treated. The concept of fit to sit. So people were, well enough to sit in a chair whilst somebody else looked after somebody else, and then eventually got round to them, and that might take 12 or 36 hours. Trains are not, if you travel on trains regularly in the UK, it's not always a great experience. In many cases it is, but it's not always that case. If you look at the kind of the divides in UK society between those people that have and those people that don't have, it's not simply the have and the not haves, it's the have lots, have some, don't have, and kind of will never have.
To address one point that you made. So you talk about how the impact about the age, and I think that we're seeing that impact nowadays because people, for instance, my age, are struggling to get onto the housing ladder. And what we're dealing with is a group of people who were able to get on the housing ladder, who are the landlord class, who have been landlords and homeowners since the 80s, who own their houses, who are now sitting on fortunes. Say if they bought a house in London for a decent price, now own a house that is worth £800,000, which when you look at the rate of yearly income to the cost of a house, it's just not even in the same ballpark. So for me to be able to afford a house, I'm going to have to work many more years to buy the house that somebody was able to
Mm,
buy a lot
mm.
more affordably. So I think back to your point about depending on when you're born really
Yeah,
does impact so much on your
yeah,
ability to live.
yeah. Do you want to talk a
And
bit about that?
yeah,
So one of the things that um, criminologists in particular, I mean, I'll obviously know much more about the criminological literature than I will um, other forms of literature. But one of the things that criminologists are becoming increasingly attuned to is what we're referring to as the birth lottery of history. So the kind of lives that you can expect to live, or that we can expect people in the society to live, are in some respects shaped not simply by where they're born, but also when they're born. So if you are born, as I was saying earlier, in the 1958 cohort that we've studied, then in some respects you were probably not massively detrimentally affected by the social and economic changes of the 1980s. Yes, some of the people born in 1958 will have lost their jobs during the recessions of the 1980s, but they were probably young enough to kind of, at that point, get jobs again. The economy did pick up, and one of the things that John Major bequeathed the new Labour government of 1997 was an economy that was doing really well. Those people who were born just 12 years later, the 1970 cohort that we've studied, they were 9 when Thatcher came in, and so they had a very different experience of that period of change in society. So they would have been living in households in which one or other or both of their parents lost their jobs, which would have affected, them materially and then their aspirations as well. So when you are born, it is as crucial to understanding life outcomes as where you're born. So you would expect to have different life outcomes if you were born in a completely different country from the UK. If you're sort of growing up in Pakistan, you'd expect to have a very different life outcome than if, for
yeah,
example, you were growing up in somewhere in the UK. That's just that's just
yeah.
how things are. Countries are
Hmm.
differently organized, they have different values, they have different structures, they have different levels of wealth. But when you're born, really kind of matters, and what's going on and the extent to which what's going on is going to enable you or your family, if you're a child, to do well is crucially important in terms of understanding what will happen to people. I mean, a lot of people say, well, why do we bother to vote? It never changes anything. But what we've been able to show is that the ideas that politicians have, or the ideas that they borrow from um, economic theory or social philosophy, those kind of ideas do translate into policies eventually, if those politicians win power. And then when they land, they will affect different people differently. So, a policy that affects schooling won't affect me now. I'm in my mid-1950s. A policy that affects schooling now won't affect me. I'm in my mid-50s,
Yeah.
but it might affect somebody who is 5. So actually, there are going to be big changes in terms of, or big differences rather, in terms of your experiences of a particular policy, depending on where you are um, in the life course. I mean, if a policy comes in and you're 5, it relates to schooling, it's probably going to affect the rest of your time at school.
I have
For
a good
somebody who's 10 years
example.
older,
I have a good example. So when I finished my A levels is when they changed this price of university tuition. So if I'd gone the year before, it'd have been £3,000, but I went when it was £9,000 a year. And then the new policies around student loan mean they can change my interest. So really, it's a new tax that I'm having to pay for my education. But
yeah,
if I went to university just a year before, I wouldn't have had the
it would
same
have been
level of
different.
debt.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there were some instances, and that's a great one, of real kind of knife edge. Bang, it comes in. And literally, if you're born this day, if you're born the day after, you do or you don't qualify for the benefit. Or in your case, if you finish school at this point, you'll be charged this for your tuition fees. And if you a year later, you're charged 3 times the amount that you would have done the year before. So yeah, there's some huge differences there.
So
Yeah.
we've just talked about how when you're born is important, but I think another factor is where you're born and how that links to crime as well.
Yeah, so one of the things that we did was to look at where prisons were in not just England and Wales, but Scotland as well. And what we did was we looked at what was on that site before a prison was there. And that's actually quite revealing. So there are, I can't remember exactly how many prisons there were in England and Wales and Scotland at that time. It's well over 100. And what we found was that in the period really after the Second World War, so from 1945 really through to 1960, lots of the prisons were built on former military sites, old airfields, for example, or old MOD bases, those sorts of things. One of the other former properties that was also turned into prisons at that time, oddly, it might sound odd to start with, were old country houses, the smaller country houses. And that's because after the Second World War, there were lots of people who, if you like, the landed gentry, who could no longer afford to maintain their posh country houses. And so they were given to the state in lieu of taxes. And that's actually where some of our universities come from as well. So Keele University, for example, came into the state ownership that way, as did what's now the basis of York University. Then, as we move on, we see still a maintenance or still a use of former military sites as prison, or the sites of prisons in the period between, say, the early 60s and the late 1970s. But then that starts to tail off, and from really the kind of the new Labour era, we see prisons being built increasingly on former industrial sites, some of which would themselves have been former coal mines, for example. And what we did was we looked at the number of prisons that were built in counties in England, Wales and Scotland, which you could label as coal mining counties. And we looked at the number of prisons that were built in non-coal mining counties. Okay, so if you want an example of a coal mining county, then you're looking at somewhere like South Yorkshire or Nottinghamshire. If you're looking at a non-coal mining county, then you're looking at somewhere like Hampshire or Surrey. Not Kent, however, because there was some coal mining in Kent. And then what we find, actually, interestingly, is there was very little difference in terms of the overall numbers of prisons that were built in non-coal mining counties was about 55, and in former coal mining counties, it was about 56. It doesn't look like there's any difference at all. But when you look at the per population rate, because some of those former coal mining counties had seen a massive decrease in population, or at least not a particularly great increase in the population, whereas the non-coal mining counties had seen quite stark increases in population. So the increase in the populations in non-coal mining areas was something in the region of 10 times what it was in when compared to former coal mining areas. So if you were building prisons evenly across England, Wales and Scotland, you'd expect to see more prisons built in non-coal mining areas, because that's where the population expansion was. In fact, actually, we see almost as many prisons built in both former coal mining areas as they were never coal mining areas, non-coal mining areas. And lots of these places actually are associated with quite heavy engineering. So my favourite example personally is a place in Cambridgeshire called March. It's spelled exactly the same as the month of the year. And March is interesting because it was once a very large railway marshalling yard, and it was used for taking coal for export and fresh fruit and vegetables coming in or going out as well. In the 1990s, that marshalling yard wasn't completely closed. It's still partially opened, but instead of being one of those marshalling yards where you come in from both ends and there's this kind of morass of railway lines full of wagons, it now has a dead end. And so things come in and they have to go out the same way. Why has it got a dead end? Well, at the other end, where half of the marshalling yard used to be, is Whitemoor Prison. So actually, we've gone from sending young men, predominantly young men, to work in heavy engineering down mines or on the railways, supporting transportation of metal and coal and all that sort of stuff. We're sending them to the same places, literally physically the same places, but they're going there to spend time in prison rather than to spend time in work. And that's true of other places as well. So Hatfield prison, there's a number of different prisons around Doncaster. In fact, where I live in South Yorkshire, Doncaster is sometimes referred to as Doncatraz because of the number of prisons that there are there. And lots of them are built on the top of where coal mining used to be. There's a prison in Peterborough called, guess what? H&P Peterborough, I believe, that's built on the site of a former factory where they built industrial-size ovens. So these were large ovens, which I guess they get used in, mass catering outlets like hospitals or schools or workplaces, those sorts of things. That factory, which was called Baker Perkins, closed, and that site was reused. One of the prisons in Doncaster was built on the site, or is built on the site, of a former power station in the centre of Doncaster. There's another one in Central Belt, Scotland, which I think is called HMP Addywell, which was built on the site of a large chemical plant. I'm not sure exactly what they did there, but they were doing some kind of chemical engineering-y type stuff. So we you can see a shift from, if you like, hard graft manual labour towards hard graft spending time in the prison in the same places, literally the same places, built one on top of the other, in the space of 40 or 50 years. We've gone from this kind of like, big heavy engineering, which was, let's not romanticize this. People were losing arms and legs, going blind. Some people were dying. People died digging coal out of the ground. People died in steel foundries. Let's not. Yeah, that's right. And then there's all of the health issues in terms of COPD. Let's not romanticize, hard manual labor. It's terrible work. But we went from that, which was, as well as being terrible, was also kind of, valorized and recognized for the good that it was doing. Miners really were working class royalty. I mean, these people were extremely well paid at their time. They did hard jobs, but they were incredibly well respected, and the communities which they came from were kind of well recognized as being well organized, tight knit communities that where people, went
you can look after a family
together, shared pain. Exactly. Whereas now we have a situation in which all of that has gone, and what's replaced it, literally, physically, what's replaced it in some instances are places of confinement. In terms of prison, that's not the only thing, of course, that's happened, but there has been a shift away from using these spaces in an economically productive sense, which was also socially productive. People get a lot of, benefit from work. They, as well as getting an income, they get a sense of identity, they get friends, they get to, understand and appreciate each other and each other's families. Where we go to this sort of situation where people are confined together. And the other thing that went with that kind of, heavy engineering based around mining or shipbuilding or driving trains were trade unions. So it's very hard to kind of prove this in any kind of statistical sense. We can do lots, and I have done lots of statistics that prove to, quite high degrees that, what we're talking about in terms of causal probability is almost certainly correct. It's very hard to prove this next point, but I suspect that, Friday night after a shift has finished, and people are drinking in a working man's club, if somebody says something that's slightly racist or that is disparaging, I suspect that in many cases the union rep might have stepped in and sort of, a bit more political consciousness than that particular individual, tried to set them right, or tried to, kind of roll them back and sort of say, well, it's not, there are other ways of looking at, black people, or there are better terms to describe that particular community. In some respects, it would die. When you lose pits and railway depots and steel plants and things like that, you lose the associated trade unions like the NUM, like the NUR, that would have, been drinking with some of these guys. And then those sorts of things that people would say that are maybe, disparaging of other people simply on the basis of their skin color or simply on the basis of their accent or things like that, are allowed to flourish because there's nobody from the trade union that is kind of politically minded and feels, empowered to question those kind of statements. There's nobody there. They're gone. They were laid off with everybody else that got laid off. And so there's a sort of, by taking away that soft authority that would have, tried to keep a lid on, racist or sexist or, if you like, not so much hate crime, but disparaging comments about other people, other communities, that's allowed to breed. And I suspect that coupled with this slow death of welfare benefits for many people from those kind of communities has fueled some of the things that we're seeing in Britain today in terms of dislike for outsiders, in terms of migrant communities or people who aren't migrants. They're born in the UK. Their parents have been born in the UK, but they look stereotypically as if they were outsiders from a different community in a different culture in a different country. So Muslim women, for example, wearing headscarves, or people who are simply the colour of their skin isn't white, and so therefore, they're assumed automatically to be outsiders and therefore immigrants. So some of those kind of quite toxic, unpleasant sentiments and feelings and expressions of those sentiments and feelings, I suspect, and again, you can't prove this, but just thinking about it in a culturally informed way, I suspect is partly, not exclusively, but partly about the loss of an organisation that had an economic function. It was standing up for workers' rights, etc., the trade unions, but also which then bled into communities in soft ways. There's lots of people drinking in working man's clubs. They might have been driving trains, members of the NUR. They might have been working in pits, members of the NUM in many senses. They would have had that same kind of soft political, you could call it indoctrination if you're on the right, or you could call it acculturation if you're thinking that there's something valuable in
Norms.
that. And that kind of went with
Norms,
and social expectations about how we treat other people and how we address and how we explain things as well. How we one of the things that those of us like myself who have studied why people worry about crime keep pointing to is, in some respects, the fear of crime rose up the political agenda and rose up the kind of survey agenda during the 1980s into the 1990s, and some of that was inevitably about rising crime. If there's lots of crime going on, yeah, you'll be worried about it. But also in some respects, when you spoke to people about those worries kind of, well, some of them were about, I'm worried about my kids getting involved in drugs. I'm worried about, the house getting broken into if I'm not here, if I get a job. They're also much less inchoate in some respects. They're much less, they're kind of almost like trying to grab gas. They're kind of ideas about change and about people no longer being able to, like the courts not being able to give proper sentences, and people these days not really kind of respecting rules and norms. So they're the sorts of things that we got from people as they explained to us, or tried to explain to us, why it was they were worried about crime. Actually, in some cases, it wasn't really crime they were worried about. They were worried about, writ large, but they didn't really have the language to articulate it. And this isn't because they were stupid. They just didn't have that language, in the same way that I can't speak French. What they were really talking about was social change that felt like they had no power over how that change would play out, or the speeds that it would play out at. So, yeah.
And the social change has been
Do you want
irreversible.
me to talk through that? Yeah, that's right. One of the things that the Thatcher governments were very good at doing was making change that you couldn't undo. So you can sell your railways. It's actually very hard to buy them back. It's what the current Labour government are doing is, in effect, waiting for those contracts to end and then just reabsorbing them. But it's not entirely clear that that's actually going to produce one unified, Great British Railways in the way that we had British Rail before. If you sell off all of your housing stock, especially to lots of different private individuals, it's very hard to buy it back individually. That will take years and decades, and it will be a very slow process. So if you're looking for, sudden big splashes, we've done this, look at this, isn't this great? It's very hard to do that. But that's exactly what Thatcher was able to do. Let's sell council housing. There we go. Let's attack mines. There we go. That's that one done. They're all gone. Let's introduce markets into schools or hospitals, those sorts of things. Let's have the big bang and kind of deregulate international finance in London. So these are things which, when you do them, it's a big event because you're smashing something up. But actually, the years and decades that it took to construct those things is very slow. And the chances of being able to reconstruct them afterwards are very, very small. And it will take years and years and years again. So actually, the changes that the Thatcher governments promulgated on the UK are not the type that you can easily undo. It's not simply a policy shift. It's a whole shift of economic thinking, which, to be perfectly honest, I don't think many Labour politicians have bought into. I mean, that may be less true for Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell, but I don't think that there was really much pushing back against the Thatcherite settlement, if you can call it that, from the likes of, for example, Tony Blair. There was a kind of an acceptance that, this is the world we're in, this is the way it's going to operate, let's try and ameliorate some of these things. And Labour embarked upon some quite socially innovative, in some respects, policies, such as the New Deal for Communities, such as Sure Start centres, such as housing action zones and education action zones. But lots of these things, in some respects, look and feel very similar to what was happening in the 1950s, as we kind of started to push through rebuilding poorer housing stock at the end of the Second World War. So they never really kind of tried to push back on that Thatcherite settlement. They sort of accepted it and tried to make it feel less unpleasant at the sharp end for some people. So here in the early, the mid 1940s and 1950s, we see lots of coal mines. They're the black dots, and we see a few prisons. And then over time, we see an increase in prison, and we see or the number of prisons. This is just simply whether there's a prison there. It's not weighted for how many people it could accept. And then you start to see a decline in the number of mines that there are. And what's interesting, I think, is that the kind of mines shift eastwards, but then by the time we get to the turn of the century, they're pretty much all gone. And so whilst there are new prisons opening and some prisons closing, you can see that over time there's a kind of, there's not really much of a clustering, because I said earlier, the coal mining areas had as many mines as the non-coal mining areas. It's the relative population, but you can see there the clustering of mines in the South Wales valleys, that little bit in Kent that I referred to earlier, the Pennine Spine, if you want to call it that ran down through Durham and County Durham and South Yorks into Nottinghamshire, and the Central Belt in Scotland, the mines that were there and to the south of Scotland, and then of course those mines on the northeast shoulder there around kind of Newcastle, etc. So what this slide does is it shows the way in which Margaret Thatcher's governments affected the criminal justice system. So their first act was in 1982. So you'll see a column there for 1982, and then the next one in 1984, 85, and so on and so forth. At the top of the table, you see what's called decreases in punitiveness. So you can see there that there were attempts to limit the use of imprisonment, or there were increased rights for suspects, those sorts of things. And then the second half, but really it's probably near a second 2/3 to 3/4 of that table, shows increases in punitiveness. So just looking at the top, where you've got that grey shaded block, you can see that whilst Margaret Thatcher was in power up to 1990, so the 1988 Criminal Justice Act would have been her last, and the 1991 Criminal Justice Act would have been the first passed when she was no longer Prime Minister. You can see that there were, some pretty sustained attempts to reduce the punitiveness of the criminal justice system. So there were, 4 of those 6 acts were designed to limit the use of imprisonment. That's what the T1 means. It's sort of there, that trend line 1. But you see, from 1993 onwards, which is when Michael Howard became Home Secretary, the 1993 Criminal Justice Act, and those that came after it, including acts in 97 and 98 when Labour had come into power. The 98 Act is the Crime and Disorder Act. The 97 is just before Labour came in. It's the Crime Sentences Act. You see, from that point on, there's no attempts to decrease levels of punitiveness, if you like. So they're being nice through the criminal justice system, or making the criminal justice system, respect the rights of suspects, for example, kind of stops pretty abruptly after 1991. And then when we look down the second part of the table, the increases in punitiveness, we see some things like increases in, post-prison release and community controls. There's a smattering of those through that 16 or so year period. But then as you go down that list, you see an increasing number of attempts to do something new, to find, if you like, new ways of being more punitive. And really that's what that dashed line running at about 45 degrees signifies, that actually all of those things there were new things. The failure to respond in sentencing, increases in actual levels of imprisonment, increases in youth imprisonment, changes to case disclosure, limits to the use of bail, etc., etc. These were new things that were coming in. So not only did the criminal justice system stop trying to limit the worst of its excesses, i.e. sending people to prison, which Willie Whitelaw famously is reputed to have said as an expensive way of making bad people worse. Not only did it cease trying to roll back from prison, it actually started to do the opposite, started to try and send more people to prison. But it also tried to find other ways of being harsh to people. That's a picture I produced of March, the railway line that I was talking
Yes.
about. So that whole brown area was once March marshalling yards. And the red ring at the end is HMP Whitemoor. So the railway line is still there. I'm not saying it's completely closed, but half of it closed really from 1990 onwards. But it is still in use. It's just nowhere near as big as it once was. When we're talking about areas in Britain which were affected in terms of economic restructuring, you see these four areas. So the light coloured areas, the areas that are kind of white coloured, are those areas where there was very little economic restructuring. That is, at one census point, lots of people employed in mining, etc., and in the second census point, lots of people who are unemployed. When you look at the dark brown areas, so you've got South Wales, you've got the area between the Mersey in the west and the Humber in the east. You've got the northeast shoulder, and then you've got Central Belt Scotland. That's where you get a real increase in economic restructuring. And it was in those kind of areas that we found a strong relationship between economic restructuring and whether kids felt alienated at school. And if the more alienated they felt at school, the more likely they were to become engaged in offending at 16. And if you're engaged in crime at 16, you're going to spend, or you're more likely rather, to spend longer involved in crime. And we found that, if you're engaged in crime at 16, you're kind of at an increased risk of offending in your mid-20s, and then if you're offending then, you're at an increased risk of offending in your 30s.
Yeah, it all makes complete sense with my experience of seeing where my family live in the northeast in a former mining colliery. And when I was there recently, I think this is really pertinent for modern day society because everyone's talking about all the flags that are going up, but the flags are going up in the places that are the most deprived. And if you go to places that were former mining collieries where you have higher rates of alcoholism, heart disease, unemployment, and just general sort of anger towards society, you're also going to see people who want a change, and the change that is being presented to them is nationalism. Thank you so much for taking us through all of that. That was really fascinating information, and I think you can definitely see a direct line from Margaret Thatcher's policies to what we're seeing happening in Britain today. I believe there's a few things you want to say before we end this conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. It's been great talking to you. Thank you very much for the invitation. I just wanted to acknowledge the work that other colleagues that I work with have done with principally Emily Gray, but also a guy called Phil Jones, who did some of the cartography. Also, some of the statistical modelling was done with a colleague at Southampton University, Will Jennings, and some of the thinking through of what we did and how we explained it was done with a colleague called Colin Hay, who works in Paris. And some of the modelling, although we didn't really refer to it much, was done with a colleague called Maria Grasso. The funding was very generously given to us by the Economic and Social Research Council in a number of different grants. There's, I think, in all three, which funded lots of the stuff. which I've been talking to you about today, and the next project, which we will be embarking on in the new year, or the spring really of 2026, is going to attempt to look at some of New Labour's social policies, such as the New Deal for Communities, such as Sure Start centres, and the impacts that they had on the lives and the life courses of those people that were born in Britain at the turn of the century, and those people who were living in England and were born in the late 1980s. So that's what's happening next for us. But we can't do any of this without the funding that we got, the very generous funding that we got from the Economic and Social Research Council. And I couldn't say any of this without the thinking and the statistical analyses and the discussions that I've had with those people that I mentioned a minute ago.
Great. Well, definitely, I think if we can get more funding to do research that can help us unpack the impacts of policies on people and their everyday lives in the UK, the more money, the merrier. So thank you. Thank you for your time.
Yes.
Thank you for your insight. And thank you for everyone who's been involved in that research as well. So I hope you found that very interesting and very insightful. Hopefully it's helped shape as to why there is some real division in this country, and how the legacy of Margaret Thatcher's impact may have different stories. Some people benefited profoundly, being able to buy homes, and then others who were unable to have had the gap between the rich and poor increase significantly as a result. And rather than dealing with the problem, there has been a degree of masking, and that is leading to imprisonment. And in fact, the UK in the last year had 3 times the amount of people imprisoned as Russia. So it's a real issue that's facing the UK today. And I hope through this knowledge, we can help do something positive to change that and improve the living conditions for the people in these deprived areas of the UK. So if you enjoyed this podcast, please feel free to watch some more of my content. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you have any questions, please send them my way, and I'll continue to question everything, as should you.